I spent 6 winters sleeping under bridges. On the 7th, I found a suitcase full of money. But what seemed like a miracle turned into a death sentence. They came after. It was an ordinary Monday. Lucía Moreno, 62 years old, woke up before the alarm clock as she always did. The apartment where she lived was tiny. Just one room with a sink, bed, and an old television that she rarely turned on. The walls smelled of mold and frying grease rising from the restaurant downstairs. But it was hers, or, rather, rented in the name of a woman who hadn't existed in the records for at least 20 years. Lucía was a laundress in a discreet hotel in the city center. It could be Miami, it could be Seville. Everything about her seemed neutral, invisible. The uniform, the bun tied with hairpins, the worn-out shoes, the way she avoided looking guests in the eye. He worked in silence. I washed sheets, uniforms, heavy curtains, and the stains of life that couldn't be removed with bleach. No one there knew his past, and that was exactly what she wanted. That day, something strange happened at the end of the shift. The last guest in the East Wing had checked out in a hurry. He had forgotten a suitcase in the maintenance closet, a place where no one should store anything. Lucía found the object while collecting floor rags, an old brown leather suitcase with a rusty clasp and a strong smell of gasoline. She looked around. Nobody around. The hallway camera had been broken for months. She picked up her suitcase, put it in the clothes cart, and pushed it to the women's locker room, heart racing, hands sweating. For a moment, he thought about handing it over to reception, but something stopped her. An instinct, an inner voice, or maybe just tired. When opened, the impact. Dozens of bundles of money, bundles wrapped in plastic, separated by labels with dates and codes. At least 70,000, maybe more. But it wasn't just that. There was a crumpled folder at the bottom of the suitcase with old photos, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes in Spanish and English. One of them showed a familiar face, a face she swore she would never see again. He sat on the wooden bench, looking at that universe that had suddenly exploded in his lap. This was not just any find. It had an owner, and that owner wouldn't just forget. He took the suitcase home at the bottom of a black trash bag. He walked quickly, avoiding cameras, holding his breath at every corner. Arriving home, he locked the door with both locks, pulled the curtain, and turned off his cell phone. He sat on the floor. He watched the suitcase for hours without touching it again. I was hungry, but I couldn't eat. The silence in the room was thick, as if the air carried the weight of everything she had tried to bury for decades. That night, he didn't sleep. The next day, when she arrived at work, the manager called her. He said there was a complaint. Someone claimed to have seen her with a suitcase that didn't belong to her. Lucía tried to deny it, but the words came out slow, disconnected. It was suspended indefinitely. He left the hotel with his eyes fixed on the ground, holding his badge as if it still meant something. Hours later, alone in the apartment, she heard footsteps in the hallway. 2 men, silent. One of them stopped in front of his door. The other was holding something metallic, a light noise, a copy of a key. They didn't knock. They didn't speak. They stayed there for a few seconds, and then they disappeared. Lucía held her breath. He almost passed out. He felt his knees give way. That was a warning. They were not in a hurry. They knew where she was, and they knew who she was. He took a deep breath. He walked to the suitcase. He touched the rough leather with his fingers. There was no way to return it. There was no way to escape. That was a calling, a reckoning, and this time there was nowhere to hide. Lucía Moreno, 62 years old, born nowhere, survivor everywhere, washerwoman by day, ghost of herself at night. The woman who spent decades trying to cover her tracks now found herself surrounded by what she had left behind. She was not innocent, but it wasn't the same as before either, and perhaps that was precisely what made her dangerous. The suitcase was still there, open, the money intact, photos scattered across the floor, and within it, a decision to be made. For the first time in a long time, Lucía knew there was no point in running. That wasn't bad. Luck. It was destiny. It was the end of a line, or the beginning of another. If you are following this story and believe that it is never too late to regain your dignity, even with the darkest past, subscribe now to the Emotion of Age channel. Turn on notifications and share with someone who needs to hear this. Because here, we don't tell victims' stories. We tell stories of those who decided to react. Lucía still didn't know what she would do, but he knew one thing. No one would put a collar around his neck anymore. The next time there was a knock on her door, she would be ready. Robo Script S Histories, USA ESP said. Lucía spent that night sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall of the small apartment, with her suitcase open in front of her, as if it were a hole in time. I couldn't sleep. His eyes remained glued to the wads of money, but it was as if he could see beyond them. I saw the reflection of who I was, of those who pretended to have left it behind. The smell of the suitcase's leather, mixed with plastic and decades-old dust, activated memories that she tried to lock away in places deeper than any drawer. At 9 years old, she already knew what hunger was. Not the common hunger of someone who doesn't have dinner for a day. It was the hunger that turns the stomach inside out, that turns the body into fever and the soul into revolt. Daughter of a woman who disappeared somewhere between the border and a dirt road, Lucía grew up in shelters. Some good, others real warehouses of abandonment. No one knew exactly where she was born. His document said Guadalajara, but that was just a piece of paper, issued years later. At 14, she ran away from her last shelter after an employee tried to force himself on her. She slept on the streets of Madrid for 4 months, until she was taken in by a woman called Rosario, who sold lunch in lunchboxes to construction workers. Rosario was the first to call her his daughter. It was also the first one she lost. At 17, Lucía already knew how to lie with her eyes. He used different names, invented accents. A man taught her how to forge documents. Another taught her to shut up. She absorbed everything, like someone who knew the world wouldn't offer second chances. It was at 21 that he crossed the border into the United States with a false passport in exchange for handing over an envelope with the identity and CPF of 3 people he didn't even know who they were. Received $4,200. He used part of it to pay for surgery for Rosario, who was sick with his liver. The rest she kept sewn inside the lining of the suitcase she was carrying. The same suitcase. Rosario didn't resist. He died months later, with a note in his hands. Forgive yourself. Lucía was never able to obey. In America, he survived as best he could. She worked as a cleaner, carer for the elderly, and a store clerk. But he always returned to the underworld. Money was faster, dirtier, more necessary. She met men who paid money to forget. Names, women who forged birth certificates like embroidering towels. He learned to encode numbers, hide tracks, decipher looks. I didn't pull triggers, but it opened doors for others to do so. In 1995, he became involved in a money laundering network linked to cartels in northern Mexico. Her job was simple, at least in appearance, delivering bags, deciphering passwords, ensuring that nothing reached the banks without going through her first. He earned between $1,500 and $3,000 per operation. I did 2 or 3 a month. He sent part of it to a children's home in Sonora, the same one where he thought his younger sister might have been. He was never sure. It was at this time that she became pregnant. Her father was a married man, a customer at one of the nightclubs where she washed casino chips. I didn't care about the child. Lucía decided to have the baby anyway. During pregnancy, she stopped acting directly, but I knew it was already marked. The boy was born in silence, in a clandestine clinic in Newark. She called him Santiago. She registered him with a surname that was not hers, and, out of fear, she gave him up for adoption days later. He thought he was saving his son from a life of shadows. He spent the next few years trying to forget, but the boy's face visited her in dreams. The laughter he never heard echoed in nightmares. In 2002, he tried to leave life for good. A friend, Laura, proposed asylum in exchange for a plea. Lucía hesitated. Not Laura. 3 weeks. Later, Laura disappeared. The body was never found, but Lucía got the message. That's when he started walking, from city to city, from name to name, from clothes to clothes. He hid in forgotten corners, surviving on small jobs, lying less and less, feeling more and more. At 50, she arrived in South Florida with a backpack and a new name, Rosa M. Garcia. He worked regularly for the first time, registered, with wallet, washing sheets in small hotels, without asking much, without answering anything. A manager once commented that she looked like a woman who had already been beaten up. She just smiled, and he continued folding pillowcases. Time pushed the pain into a dark corner of the mind, but she never forgot. I kept every old note, every name, every face. And above all, he remembered the suitcase, because the suitcase was proof that what she experienced was real. It was also a symbol of what she tried to bury. And now, ironically, It was the suitcase that had returned. Lucía never told anyone who she really was, not even when, at 59, she almost died from a lung infection and had to be hospitalized. She used false documents and was treated as a pauper. He left the hospital with yet another debt, yet another burned identity, yet another notebook hidden under the mattress. I knew where Santiago was. Sometimes I imagined he lived in another country, others that he was already dead. What she never imagined was that he could be close, much less that one day, that past would return through the front door with cold eyes and silent steps. Sitting in front of her suitcase, she touched one of the photos with trembling fingers. She recognized the face of a man who one day threatened to kill Rosario if she didn't deliver a package. He also saw the face of a woman who disappeared after a whistleblower in the 90s, and in the background, what appeared to be a local politician, younger, smiling at some ceremony. That suitcase wasn't just money. It was a file, a living dossier, a map of crimes that had not yet been paid for. Why did that appear in her hands? By mistake? By destiny? By trap? I did not know, but I knew enough to understand that it wasn't luck. It took years to become invisible, to erase traces, dates, accents. Now, everyone was back, as if time had turned around and returned to charge interest. Lucia's hands were shaking, but not out of fear. It was something else. It was as if the whole body recognized the moment, as if she knew, without a doubt, that that suitcase didn't appear for nothing, that it was all a choice, the last test, the chance the universe gave her so that, for the first time, she wouldn't run away, and this time, maybe she would choose to stay. The next day, Lucía woke up before the sun rose. The head throbbed. Every sound on the street, every noise in the building's corridor seemed to carry a threat. The body was still in a state of alert. He made black coffee, strong, bitter as the years he carried on. His back. He sat on the edge of the bed, his suitcase closed beside him like a sleeping animal that could wake up at any moment. He thought about running away. He thought about packing everything up and disappearing once again. I had already done this before. I knew the paths, the shortcuts, the places where I could disappear for another 10 years. But something inside her was different. A tiredness that wasn't physical, a deeper exhaustion. I didn't want to run anymore, maybe because there was nowhere else to go. The old phone, which he used only for emergencies, rang around 9 in the morning, an unknown number. She didn't answer, but the message came soon after, without identification. Just one sentence. You know what you have, and you know it's not yours. Lucia's hand froze. The cell phone almost fell out of his fingers. He deleted the message but knew it wouldn't change anything. They knew where she lived. They knew she had opened the suitcase, and they knew she was alone. At the end of the afternoon, he left the house for the first time since the incident. He covered his face with a scarf. He walked to an internet cafe near the station. He printed some of the photos from the suitcase. He made copies of the notes and kept everything in an envelope that he hid inside the living room cushion. It was a precaution. If something happened, someone would need to know. At the hotel, the atmosphere was tense. The manager watched her suspiciously. Some colleagues whispered in the corridors. Lucía heard one of them say that an anonymous tip had been made, that she had been seen with a suitcase that wasn't hers. Security footage showed her pushing the cart toward the locker room with something inside. Nothing conclusive, but enough to get fired on the spot. She was humiliated in front of everyone. He left with his uniform in his bag, without even a penny of severance pay. The manager handed over a paper with cold words. Her record as a good employee no longer mattered. At the hotel door, he felt people's eyes on his back, some curious, others indifferent, but all distant. Once again, she was alone. On the way back, he received another message. Just 2 words. You chose. There was no number. There was no face. But there was a clear warning. The suitcase was now more than proof. It was a trap, and Lucía had fallen for it. Arriving home, I was scared. The door was ajar, the lock intact, nothing broken. She pushed slowly, her heart racing. The room was silent, but the suitcase had been moved. Nothing was missing, at least not visibly, but she knew that was a signature. They had entered, scrambled, and left. No rush, with control, just to show they could. Lucía sat on the floor. The world was spinning around, breath caught in the chest. It was like being back in the past, as if every step taken in the last 20 years was being erased one by one. I didn't know what to do. Go to the police? And tell what? that he had found a suitcase full of money, photos, and secret documents in a cheap hotel? That she was a former criminal living under a false name? What men were threatening her without leaving a trace? They would laugh at her, or worse, they would arrest her. It was that same day that he received a call that stopped time. The voice was male, young, but firm. I wanted to confirm the name. Lucía Moreno. She hesitated. The silence gave it away. The voice continued. No need to be scared, ma'am. My name is Santiago. I'm a police officer, and I think you're my mother. The ground seemed to collapse beneath his feet. The head throbbed. He felt his breathing hitch. That word echoed in his ears like an explosion. Mom. After so many years, so many nights awake wondering if he still existed, if he had been well taken care of, if he was alive. He was, and he was a police officer. And now, she was involved in an investigation that would inevitably take her back to the past. Lucía didn't know what to answer. The silence became long. He said he would call back, that I knew it was difficult, which she had the right to deny, but it deserved answers. She hung up without saying anything. The cell phone fell to the floor. The suitcase next to it seemed to be watching her. Everything was intertwined. The past, the sun, the enemies, the tests, and now, the choice. She cried for the first time in many years, but it wasn't a cry of despair. It was a cry of old pain, which had been trapped for decades. It was also a cry of anger. Anger at herself, at mistakes, at fears, at escapes. Anger at having let himself be silenced for so long. At the end of the night, Lucía did something she hadn't done since the 90s. He opened an old Bible that he kept hidden behind a cabinet. Inside, between the pages, was a note from Rosario, the same one she had kept since her wife's death. It was yellowed, but still readable. Forgive yourself. For the first time, he read it out loud. If you are following this story and believe that it is never too late to face your past, comment from which city you are watching. And don't forget to subscribe to the Emotion of Age channel, because here we show that starting over is possible, even for those who have already lost almost everything. That night, Lucía didn't sleep, but he made a decision. The time for escapes was over. She needed to know who the owners of the suitcase really were. I needed to understand why all this was coming back now, and above all, he needed to look his son in the eye, even if he hated her. The next call would not be ignored. The next knock on the door would not find her defenseless. For the first time in a long time, she was going to react, even if it was late, even if it hurt, even if it cost everything. The day dawned heavy. The overcast sky reflected what Lucía felt inside. The shadows of the past, which for years seemed asleep, now walked beside her. The apartment was silent, but not peaceful. It was an ambush silence, a silence that hides breathing behind the walls, eyes on the other side of the door, intentions that have not yet been revealed. Lucía spent the entire morning without touching her coffee. He walked from side to side with his hands clasped behind his back, as if he were trying to decide which direction of his life still belonged to him. The envelope with copies of the evidence was still hidden in the room's pillow. The suitcase was locked inside the closet, but its weight spread throughout the room, suffocating. He went to the supermarket, but not out of necessity. He needed to walk, feel the air, watch the people, remember that the world outside was still spinning. But, in the middle of the checkout line, he heard a sentence that froze his spine. A girl on her cell phone was talking about a suspicious woman who had been fired from a hotel in the region. He said the name of the neighborhood, then said something about the police investigating. Lucía didn't wait for change. He left the market as if the ground was on fire. This was spreading too fast. When she arrived at the building manager was waiting for her in the lobby, discreet but tense. He said he had received a notification from the administration. A police officer was looking for a woman who matched her description. Lucía tried to act surprised, but the words came out harsh. He climbed the stairs slowly, as if the weight of his body increased with each step. In the apartment, he found his cell phone, with a new message. This time, it was a photo. The door of the house, taken from the front. No subtitles, no written threat, but it was worse than any words. They were watching. They knew when she left, where she went, what she did. The feeling was like being trapped in an aquarium, exposed, being analyzed by patient predators. The next few hours were a parade of painful memories, and in the midst of this chaos, Santiago called again. Lucía answered. His voice was firmer. He said he was all ready. Sure, That an analysis of old records confirmed that she was, in fact, the woman he was looking for. He didn't seem angry. On the contrary, he looked scared, but determined. He said he needed to see her, not as a police officer, like a son. She scheduled the meeting for the end of the afternoon on a discreet park bench far from the center. He arrived ahead of schedule, sat on the cement bench, and watched the people on the street. When he saw him approaching, time stopped. Santiago was taller than she imagined. Dark eyes, tense eyebrows, erect posture. He stopped a few steps away from her. I didn't say anything. She tried laugh, but he couldn't. The silence lasted for long seconds, until he asked if she really was his mother. His voice didn't carry hate, but there was pain. An old pain, of abandonment, of absence, of questions never answered. Lucía tried to explain. He said he was afraid, that he wanted to protect him, that he thought that if he left him with another family, he would have a better chance, that she was too dangerous, surrounded by unforgiving people. But when he mentioned these people, Santiago approached. He said that investigation, the suitcase, the photos, all of that involved big figures, politicians, business people, people with power. And that, interestingly enough, it all started with her name. That maybe it wasn't a coincidence. That maybe the suitcase was placed there on purpose, to expose her, to silence her, or to attract others. Lucía listened, in silence, trying to absorb everything. But when he asked why she didn't look for him, he got no answer, just tears. Tears held back for years. He said something that pierced his chest like a knife. He said he grew up hearing that his mother had died, who imagined a grave, a tragic story, but discovering that she was alive and had abandoned him was 1,000 times worse. You chose to disappear, and I chose to grow up without you. The words echoed. She tried to touch him, but he pulled away. He said he needed to think, that I didn't know if I could forgive, but for now, he would keep his distance, for her safety, for his, and for the names that were now emerging. He left her there, on the park bench, with her heart torn apart, once again, alone. Lucía returned home in the early evening. As soon as he opened the door, he knew something had changed. The room smelled like cheap men's perfume. Someone had entered again, and this time they left something on the bed. A photo. She, younger, next to Laura, the friend who had disappeared. On the back of the photo, written in red pen, "You will be the next to disappear." Lucía sat down slowly. I was tired, but there was something different in his eyes, an old glow, something that reminded her of who she was before the fear, before the escapes, before the silence. That morning, she didn't sleep. He turned on the old computer that he almost never used. He opened a hidden folder with documents, old contacts, notes from years ago, typed names, looked for connections, searched files. He began to put the puzzle together, because now she knew it was time to react, time to change the game, not for revenge, but for dignity. If you are following this story and have already felt the weight of a past that insists on returning, comment below with the key word of the week, dignity, and share this story with someone who needs to remember that it's never too late to face the truth. The morning passed like a breath. When the sun rose, Lucía already had a plan. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't just a survivor. He was a witness. It was living proof, and I was ready to talk. Lucía spent the entire day locked in the apartment, with the windows covered with blankets and her cell phone turned off. The computer, which hadn't been turned on in years, had now become his weapon. I was looking for names, old addresses, digitized newspaper clippings, files that were still loose in the cloud. The suitcase was open on the bed, as if it were also participating in the investigation. All around, sheets were scattered, pens with scribbled notes, Post-its stuck to the wall like pieces of a puzzle that was beginning to take shape. She reviewed every photograph, every note inside the folder hidden under the money. Some names didn't make sense, but others awakened memories that came like punches to the stomach. One of them was Luis Mendoza, a man who in the 90s controlled the network for transporting cash across borders. He had mysteriously disappeared in 2003, according to records. But there, before her eyes, was a recent photo. Mendoza was now an influential businessman, owning a private security conglomerate that contracted with municipal governments. It was alive, and he was protected. Lucía took a deep breath. I knew I couldn't face this alone. She also knew that the traditional police would not listen to her. But he knew a name, someone from the past, a lawyer who, years ago, had helped Rosario with a labor case, a man who had moved away from the dirty world, but who still owed a favor. She entered the number from memory. He answered in a sleepy voice. Lucía identified with her old name. A long silence passed through the line. Then he said he needed to see her, but not in a public place. They agreed to meet in the empty parking lot of an abandoned store. At the meeting, Lucía was direct. He handed over a copy of the photos and showed some notes. He explained the origin of the suitcase and the series of threats. He listened to everything in silence. Then he lit a cigarette without even asking permission. He said if it involved that, no, there would be a return. But he also said something that Lucía never forgot. You've spent your whole life hiding. Maybe it's time to use what you know before they bury you with all this. In the following days, with the help of her lawyer, she wrote a confession. But it wasn't just any confession. It was a truth letter. It detailed dates, locations, transactions, names. It explained how certain public figures used women like her to transport documents, launder money, and silence witnesses. She also recorded a video. Looking straight into the camera, in a firm voice, he said who he was, what he had done, and why he was speaking now. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He asked for justice. The video was saved on 2 pen drives. One stayed with the lawyer, the other she hid in a hole behind the toilet. The suitcase, now empty of money, was still with her. It was no longer the prize, it was proof, and Lucía knew that that could change everything. Santiago called again. The voice was more tired. He said he had been temporarily removed from the investigation due to his personal connection to the case, but he would continue to look for evidence on his own. He also said that he received an offer. Someone came to him, offering money to forget his mother's name in the reports. When Lucía asked who it was, he hesitated. He said he was an old acquaintance of hers, a man called Father Elias. But Elias was never a real priest. It was just a code name, and now he was acting as a political advisor to an important deputy. Lucía felt her stomach turn. Elias had been responsible for recruiting young people in the 90s to work as messengers. She knew him well. I was afraid of him. A fear that was now returning with full force. That same night, the lawyer called saying the video was safe, but he had received a warning. 2 men followed him home. They didn't say anything. They just stopped on the other side of the street and stayed there for 20 minutes. Then they left. Lucía understood. The time was coming. They knew she had something, and then they would act. But now, for the first time, she wasn't just a target, it was a threat. She decided to act before it was too late. He sent copies of the video to 2 independent journalists who had been investigating corruption for years. Used a false name, didn't ask for a return. He just sent it and deleted everything. Then he went to the old abandoned church where he used to hide when he was young. He buried the suitcase along with the last physical copies of the documents. He placed a piece of paper with the location on the refrigerator under a rusty magnet. If something happened, someone would find it. The following morning, something changed. One of the journalists published on his social networks that he had received confidential information and that, in the coming days, he would reveal the biggest political scandal of the last decade. He didn't mention names, but he mentioned a woman, a survivor, a living witness. Lucía watched the video trembling. For the first time, he saw his story being told without fear. No makeup, no silence. I knew it was now marked, but I also knew that I was no longer alone. Santiago sent one last message. He said he now believed her, that I didn't understand everything, that he still felt angry, but he admired her, and if she wanted to stay alive, she needed to go to the end. Lucía smiled, a small, painful, but true smile. For the first time since finding that suitcase, she felt something different, a kind of strength that came not from anger, but from truth. She was no longer the woman hidden between hotel sheets. It was a key piece, and he would go as far as necessary. If this story is moving you, if at some point you found yourself on this path of pain, courage, and recovery, leave your comment now with the key word of the week, courage, and share it with someone who needs to understand that sometimes the past doesn't come back to destroy, come back to free. The night fell heavily, but Lucía was no longer afraid of the darkness. She was ready for the next step, and now, the names she bore were no longer just secrets. They were weapons. The hours leading up to the confrontation seemed longer than the years on the run that Lucía had experienced. Every second was filled with dense silence, short breathing, and alert thoughts. The city continued its course, cars passing, people walking hurriedly, voices crossing sidewalks. But for her, everything was on hold, as if time was waiting for the right moment to collapse. The lawyer called at 7:30 in the morning. The special hearing had been approved. It would be a reserved meeting, called at the last minute, behind closed doors, without press coverage. But Lucía knew that, even hidden, that was the decisive stage. The figures involved were too large to allow exposure, and for that reason, she needed to be prepared for everything. He wore the same simple clothes he wore to work: dark pants, beige blouse, hair tied up, no makeup, no adornment. She didn't need it. It seems strong. She needed to be strong. He put a copy of one of the original tickets in his pocket, which included Mendoza's name alongside dates and amounts. He kept the paper like someone carrying an amulet, a symbol. The last reminder that, even though she was treated as disposable, she always knew too much. She arrived at the hearing building escorted by 2 security guards, not out of protocol, but out of necessity. The lawyer had insisted. He said that strange movements had been recorded around the location. 2 cars driving around, men taking photos from afar. Lucía got out of the vehicle with firm steps. The entrance to the building looked like a manhole, but she didn't hesitate. The assistant judge, 2 public prosecutors, her defense lawyer, and 2 representatives from the Internal Affairs Department were present in the room. It was not a traditional court. It was more of an informal agreement, a legalized wiretap. But the tension was that of the court. When they asked if she wanted to say something, Lucía looked up. The voice was low at first, but as she spoke, something inside her began to loosen, as if the words were not just spoken to them, but to everyone who for years had denied their existence. He talked about the work in the 90s, about how women like her were used to carry documents, money, contracts. He talked about names, of places, from threats. He told how Laura had disappeared after trying to leave, and like others, they disappeared without a trace. He said the suitcase was not found by chance, that it was a message, that those men came back because they knew she still carried memories that could destroy important people. When the judge asked why she had remained silent for so long, Lucía looked directly at him and said firmly, "Because women like me have never been heard, because silence has always been safer than the truth. But today, if I have to fall, let it be by saying who I really was." The most tense moment came when Mendoza's name was mentioned. One of the prosecutors tried to interrupt, saying that that name was not on the agenda. Lucía's lawyer reacted firmly. He presented copies of the documents, dates, values, cross-signatures, linking shell, companies to the entrepreneur's name. The room fell into an eerie silence. It was as if everyone there knew, but hearing it from her mouth made it impossible to ignore. Then, one of the side doors opened, and the man entered. Mendoza, now known as Luis de la Cruz, the businessman philanthropist, the face that graced magazine covers and community-giving programs, walked to the center of the room without rushing. He asked to speak. The judge denied it, but he continued. He said it was a hoax, that Lucía was a repentant criminal trying to bargain for freedom, said she had no proof, that everything he said could be forged. Lucía stood up. He didn't scream, didn't argue. He just looked into his eyes and responded, "You spent 30 years believing that people like me would remain silent forever. But your luck is that I didn't come here for revenge. I came to stop others like Laura from dying without a voice." Mendoza sneered, said she was weak, and deep down, he was still afraid. Lucía took a deep breath. He touched his pocket and took out the original note. He placed it on the table. He said that signature was his, and that was enough to open a process that he couldn't control. The judge requested a recess. The hearing was suspended for 1 hour. In the next room, Lucía's lawyer announced that the press had obtained a copy of the video that was already circulating on social media, that in less than 12 hours, the entire country would know who she was and what he had done. Lucía didn't show panic, just tired. He asked about his son. The lawyer said that Santiago was at the police station, helping to organize the files that could support the allegations. He did not go to the hearing on the recommendation of the Internal Affairs Department, but he sent a message. It just said, "I'm with you, until the end." In the second part of the hearing, everyone's stance had changed. Mendoza did not return. His lawyers claimed medical reasons, but it was fear. Fear of repercussions. Fear of tests. Fear of losing control. The judge ended the session with a temporary opinion. Lucía would be under special protection until the case was formally forwarded. There would be restrictions, internal investigations, and the possibility of a future sentence reduction if other information were confirmed. At the exit, journalists were waiting. Cameras, microphones, flashes. She walked past everyone without saying a word, but the image of her, walking with her head held high, was captured, and it went viral. Later, in the apartment, Lucía sat on the living room floor, exhausted. The suitcase, now empty, was still there, but it was no longer a threat. It was a symbol of everything she carried silently. And now, finally, it had been exposed. If this story made sense to you, if at any point you also, although you had to face old ghosts to recover your truth, comment now with the word justice. Like, share and send to someone who still thinks the truth should be hidden forever. Lucía knew she wasn't free yet, but for the first time, it was clean. And that, for someone with her background, was more than freedom. It was rebirth. 6 months after the hearing, Lucía Moreno's life had not returned to normal, and maybe he would never come back. But for the first time in decades, she was living under her own name, a name that was now in official records, in court reports, and most importantly, in one's own conscience. He was no longer hiding. I didn't lie. And that, to her, was worth more than any freedom she had had in the past. The apartment where he lived for the last few years was vacated. He left the place voluntarily, like someone taking off an old skin full of scars, memories, and fear. Now she lived in a small room at the back of a community center, where she worked on a social project with homeless women and at-risk youth. It was voluntary. He didn't receive a salary, but every day, I woke up knowing exactly why and who I was there for. Morning started. Early. Strong coffee, simple clothes, a folder with papers, reports, and plans. I coordinated sewing and literacy workshops. He taught women to write letters, to read medicine leaflets, to recognize their own rights. He told parts of his story only when necessary, never as a victim. Always like someone who survived their own silence. There was something in her eyes that other women respected. A firmness that did not come from arrogance, but from someone who has been on the other side of the line, where life seems to be worthless. Lucía didn't judge. I didn't correct it with my finger raised. She listened, welcomed, and, when possible, he provided guidance. Time had changed his gestures. I was no longer cowering. She walked upright, with slow but firm steps. Her hair, previously hidden, was now loose, with visible and proud white strands. Her face, marked by deep wrinkles, showed everything she had experienced without apologizing for it. Her hands still shook sometimes, but she didn't hide it. The shaking was what was left of the years of fear. And yet now, she sewed with them. Weave lives. He restored dignities. Santiago visited her once a month. The conversations were short at first. Long silence. He still called her Lucía, never from a mother. But there was no longer any aggression in his voice. Just a genuine effort to understand. They sat on the bench in the community center square, drank coffee without sugar, talked about the project, about the investigation still underway, about the developments in the Mendoza case. He told about the internal meetings, the political maneuvers, the hushed processes. Lucía listened to everything without surprise. I already expected that. She no longer sought perfect justice. I knew the world didn't work with clear endings. But something inside her calmed down every time she saw a new woman entering the center, with her eyes downcast, her hands dirty, and her hope in ruins. Because it was there, at that moment, that she remembered that every step she took, every test she gave, every truth she shouted, was not in vain. One day, a teenager came into the classroom and said that she had seen Lucía's face in an old video on the internet. He asked if all that was true. Lucía smiled. I said yes, which was true. Who was a washerwoman, a fugitive, an accomplice, and a witness, and yet it was there, alive, entire, and with enough courage not to lie anymore. Reconciliation with the past was not complete. There were still sleepless nights, nightmares about Laura calling for help, dreams about Rosario writing notes that never arrived, letters from the time that life did not allow us to read. There were still pains in the body that no medicine could cure, but there was also a new peace, a kind of silent agreement between her and everything she experienced. The memories of the day he found the suitcase no longer came with terror. Now, they seemed just part of the way, a piece of the puzzle that had to fall from the sky for her to finally look inside. The suitcase was never found again. After being buried in the old church, a landslide destroyed part of the site, and with it, any physical trace of what was inside. But it didn't matter. What needed to be said was said. What needed to be shown was recorded in dozens of files, reports, and testimonies. And most importantly, it was recorded in his own voice. Lucía wrote a letter to Santiago, not to ask for forgiveness, but to tell him things I never said in person. Little things. What kind of music did she like? Who was afraid of heights? That the name Santiago came from a dream with a field full of white horses. Things that might not change anything, but that he deserved to know. The letter was never delivered. It was kept inside a notebook blue cover, along with other notes. Lucía didn't want to pressure him. Just leave the door open. I knew he had his own time, and that respect sometimes is the most difficult form of love. In the late afternoon, when the sun shined through the windows of the community center, she used to sit on the porch with a mug of tea and watch the women laughing, sewing, swapping stories. It was there, at that moment, that I felt that everything had been worth it, because none of them knew their full past, and yet they called her Mrs. Lucía, with respect, with admiration, with affection, and that was enough. If this story touched your heart, if at some point you found yourself on this path, leave your comment with the keyword Renascer. Like the video, subscribe to the Emotion of Age channel, and activate the bell. And above all, share this story with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to face the past and regain one's dignity. Because sometimes it's exactly what seemed like the end that opens the door to the true beginning. Lucía learned to live with silence, but no longer the silence of fear. It was now the silence of acceptance, a silence that does not hurt, that does not threaten, that does not paralyze. It was the silence that comes when you have nothing left to hide, when the story was told, when the soul no longer needs to shrink. As the months passed, she began to walk the streets without looking over her shoulder. The faces I met no longer seemed like threats. Some smiled, others just recognized her. The video with his testimony was still circulating on some networks, used by support groups, NGOs, and social projects that showed that, even after the abyss, it is still possible to build a bridge. Lucía had become a symbol, not heroism, not perfection, but with courage, in truth, from someone who, after being hidden for so long, had the strength to say who she was, and more than that, to show who I could still be. Authorities did not resume criminal proceedings against her. The agreement reached during the hearing provided that, as long as he collaborated with the investigations and remained under supervision, his sentence would be converted into community work. In practice, this was freedom with purpose, a life under surveillance, but without shackles. Santiago kept in touch, still sporadic, still full of pauses, but something inside him had also changed. On one of the visits, he brought a box with childhood photos. He said he had met with the adoptive family. There was little contact, but respect. He showed Lucía a photo of him at 8 years old, playing in a backyard with a blue bicycle. She held the image with both hands, as if it were a materialized piece of time. That night, alone in her room at the community center, she cried in silence, with the photo pressed against her chest. It wasn't sadness, it was mourning. The mourning of everything that didn't live alongside him, but it was also gratitude, because he's alive, because he chose to look at her with humanity, even without any obligation. The social project grew. Other women began to arrive. They brought their own ghosts, their own suitcases loaded with stories, and Lucía knew exactly how to receive them, not with advice, but with presence. He sat with them, listened, offered tea, showed them how to cut a fabric pattern. Little by little, without rushing, the words emerged, the tears came, and along with them, the beginning of some reconstruction. One day, a 59-year-old woman entered the center and said that she had left an abusive relationship after 20 years. There was nowhere to go. I was ashamed to ask for help. Lucía hugged her. He said that sometimes you have to lose everything to finally find yourself, that the greatest shame is to remain silent. And there, No story would be discarded. The woman cried in her arms, and Lucía felt that she had returned to the right place, even if that place was not the same place where she was born. There were days of extreme tiredness, days when the body asked for rest, when the pain in the legs reminded me of the weight of age. But she didn't give up. No more. I knew there was something bigger at stake. I knew that every small change was a form of justice, not the courts, but that of dignity. One rainy afternoon, Santiago took her to see the new place where he worked, a special listening sector for victims of crimes linked to the past. Upon entering, Lucía saw a phrase painted on the wall. "It's never too late to tell your story." He said she had inspired it. She didn't respond. He just walked down the corridor, observing the welcoming rooms and the prepared professionals. There, she saw a piece of the future that she never imagined living, and he understood that his scars had turned into seeds. The suitcase was never unearthed. The place where he buried her had been renovated. They built a parking lot over the ruins of the church, but Lucía didn't care. The real proof was no longer there. "I was in your voice, in the records, in the faces of the women who now stood up." The suitcase did its job. It was the portal, the turning point, the bridge between escaping and choosing to stay. A year has passed since that first day she found the object. And if someone asked her if she would change anything, she would say yes. That if I had had courage before, perhaps less pain would have been experienced. But deep down, I also knew that everything happened when it had to happen, and that even the longest pain can give way to peace without makeup. She decided to write an open letter, a short text, direct. He asked that it be read at a public meeting of women at risk. He said he couldn't be present, but he wanted to leave something. In the letter, he wrote the following: "I'm Lucía. I'm 63 years old. I was used, persecuted, silenced, but I survived. My story was not clean nor pretty, but it's mine. And now it also belongs to all of you. Let no one say it's too late. Let no one silence what screams inside you. The truth is not easy, but free. And freedom, when it comes from the soul, no one takes it back." The letter was read in a crowded hall. Applause filled the space, and even from a distance, Lucía felt it, as if every word echoed back inside her, washing away the last traces of doubt. If you've listened this far, if you've reached this point in the story, it's because you believe that no one needs to be perfect to be worthy. Leave your comment with the keyword freedom, and share this story with someone who, like Lucía, was once called lost, but just needed a fresh start. Subscribe now to the Emotion of Age channel. Activate the bell and help spread this message. Because yes, there are pains that last a lifetime, but there are also truths that liberate generations. Lucía now knew. She was not what they did to her. She was what she chose to do with what was done to her, and that choice no one else could take away. Time seemed to have changed texture for Lucía. It was no longer rough like the nights she spent hiding. It wasn't smooth either. It was firm, dense, as if every minute now carried a purpose. The weeks, following the reading of his public letter, were filled with small gestures that, little by little, redesigned his surroundings. And with that, she also redesigned the way she saw herself. One Saturday morning, a young woman appeared at the gate of the community center with a child in her arms. He had tired eyes, shabby clothes, and a weak voice. He said he had heard about a lady who didn't judge anyone, who helped without asking, and if that were true, I wanted to stay. Lucía asked him to come in. He didn't ask where he came from. He didn't ask for explanations. He just opened the kitchen door, prepared bread and butter, heated milk, and said he could rest. It was like this, in that place, that the stories began again. No pressure, no requirement, only with reception. Lucía had understood that sometimes starting over is just having a place to sit without being questioned. And that was enough to give the person the courage he lacked. At night, alone in the back room, she reviewed notes she had made in small notebooks. I used to record the name of each woman who arrived, not real names, but symbolic names: warrior, silent, phoenix, ember. And next to it, I wrote the first gesture that identified in them the desire to continue. A smile, a question, a tear. It was her way of following without invading, to map pain without having to narrate it. Santiago sent messages more frequently now, sometimes just one line. "Good morning. I ate the lasagna you taught me. I saw a documentary about human trafficking and thought of you. The words were raw but sincere. Lucía understood that love between them would not come in the traditional way, but it would come, and that was enough. One day, he showed up unexpectedly at the community center. It was different, less tense. He sat down next to her on the porch. They remained silent for long minutes. Then he took a new badge out of his pocket. He said he had been transferred to a special witness protection unit. Who asked? To work on cases like hers. She looked into his eyes and said nothing, just smiled, a small but whole smile. The following month, the community center received a visit from a team of independent filmmakers. They wanted to make a short film based on real stories of female survivors. They had read about Lucía. They wanted to interview her. She hesitated. He thought about refusing, but then he accepted. As long as it was in voiceover, let the face not appear, and that the focus was on the project, the other women, lives rebuilt. Pain didn't need a face, but it needed space to exist. The documentary was released online. It had thousands of views, comments from people from different countries. Some said they had been touched deeply. Others, who started therapy after watching. Lucía did not seek fame, but he understood that the exposure of the truth, done with dignity, had the power to heal in chains. He then began writing letters to women who were in prisons, in reception centers, in rehabilitation clinics. The letters were simple, always written by hand. They started with the same sentence: "You're still alive, and that's enough to start over." He signed with just one letter, L. I knew that the name no longer mattered as much as the message. One rainy afternoon, while organizing donations in the warehouse next to the center, Lucía found an old suitcase among the boxes. It was empty, spent, but it was almost identical to the one that had changed his life. She stood still for a few seconds, staring at the object as if it were breathing. Then he took a marker and wrote a single word on the worn leather: choice. He placed the suitcase in the center's entrance hallway. It became a silent symbol. Nobody played, but everyone knew what she represented. It was a living reminder that every journey of escape can become a path of return. Just the decision. At one of the weekly meetings with the women's group, Lucía did something she had never done before. He shared part of his story in the first person. He told how he ran away under a false name, how he abandoned a son out of fear, how he hid for decades. The room was silent. Some women were crying, others just listened with absolute attention. And when she finished, there were no questions, just a long group hug. There, in that modest room, with the smell of coffee and hope, she felt part of something bigger than her own pain. Lucía started organizing reading circles. I chose books that talked about female resistance, identity, forgiveness. And always, at the end of each meeting, I asked the same question. If you could write one sentence for the 20-year-old self, what would you say? The answers were exciting, strong. Some hurt, others healed, but they all left marks. And Lucía collected these phrases on a wall that was next to the suitcase. Over time, other leaders began to emerge in the center. Women who ran the workshops, who created events, who took care of new arrivals. Lucía gradually moved away from her day-to-day tasks, not because of tiredness, but because he knew he had fulfilled his role. And that now was the time to leave space for other voices to flourish. But she was still there, always there, sitting on the porch with the mug in her hands, watching. And when they asked what she did there, she answered simply, I take care of the roots. Because without roots, nothing can sustain itself. If this story has followed you here, if it left a mark on your chest, write the word choice in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the Emotion of Age channel, activate the bell, and send this story to someone who is on the edge, needing to remember that life doesn't end with mistakes. It can start right there. And never forget, a suitcase full of money almost destroyed Lucía, but it was the decision to tell the truth that rebuilt her. And you, what do you choose to carry? Lucía Moreno, now 64 years old, walks slowly through the streets of the neighborhood, where the community center is located. The feet touch the floor firmly, but without rushing. She doesn't run anymore. He learned that haste belongs to those who are still running, not her anymore. The body has aged, it's true. There are days when the pain in her joints reminds her of the years she slept on the ground, under bridges, or in cold shelters. But now these pains do not define your existence. They are just signs of the path taken. Over time, her face gained new expressions, not from constant laughter. Lucía is not a woman who smiles all the time, but he carries a serenity in his eyes that only those who faced hell with courage can carry. A discreet, dignified peace built not by the absence of suffering, but by the conscious decision to no longer allow pain to silence it. Today, when she arrives at the center's gate, she is greeted with hugs, with loving looks, with voices that call her with respect. Miss Lucía, the one who listens, the one who understands, the one who doesn't look away even when faced with the crudest stories. It became a reference, but he never let it go to his head. She always says she's not an example of anything, who is only alive because someone one day reached out to her. And now it's your turn to do the same. The women who come to her see a possible mirror. They see an ordinary woman with mistakes, failures, and guilt, but who one day decided to stop running away. And that simple decision, almost banal in the eyes of the world, was what transformed everything. There was no magic. There was no instant redemption. There was only courage, a silent courage, made up of small acts, daily choices, refusals to return to the darkness. The social project she started now has its own name. It's called Recomeço Vivo. It is supported by donations and volunteer work. And more than clothes or basic baskets, the offers listening, welcoming, guidance. In one of the rooms, there is a wall with hundreds of handwritten notes. Each note contains a quote from someone who passed by. One of these phrases, written by a 72-year-old lady, goes like this: "Dignity is the only thing we should never take off, even if everything else is ripped away from us." Lucía reads that sentence every time she feels tired, and in it, he finds the strength to continue. Santiago now calls her mother. The first time she did this, Lucía cried for hours alone in the center's room. He didn't tell anyone. He remembered that moment as if it were a miracle. And maybe it was. A miracle built with patience, with truth, with presence. He still bears the scars of abandonment, but he chose, for himself, to walk alongside her. And Lucía never forced it. It just became available. One sunny afternoon, the two walked through a local fair. He was holding a bag of vegetables. She was looking at the stalls as if recognizing the value of a ripe orange, the smell of freshly baked bread. It was a common scene, but for both of them, it was a gift. Years ago, they wouldn't have imagined being there, together, in peace. No secrets. Lucía still writes. She keeps notebooks full of thoughts, reflections, phrases that she hears and that touch her. Sometimes he writes letters that he never sends. Other times, he leaves anonymous notes on park benches, in libraries, in mailboxes. Notes that say things like, "You deserve to be heard," or "No one teaches you how to start over, but you can start even without knowing how." She says she may never be remembered in official history, that your name will not appear in books or headlines. But if at least one woman, somewhere in the world, can look at herself with less shame and more tenderness because of everything she has lived and shared, then it will all have been worth it. And this is exactly the lesson that Lucía leaves. That starting over is not erasing the past. It's learning to walk with it at your side, like someone carrying an old suitcase, but now they know what can be thrown away and what is still useful. It's understanding that forgiveness doesn't always come from others. Sometimes it is we who need to forgive ourselves in silence, between one breath and another, between a restrained cry and a step forward. Lucía teaches that justice does not always come from the courts. Sometimes it comes when we can face the mirror without looking away, when we can tell the truth without begging for absolution, when we choose, day after day, not to repeat the patterns that almost destroyed us. And that freedom is not the absence of bars. It is the presence of dignity. If you listen to this story until the end, if it touched something inside you, if at some point you saw yourself in Lucía or in one of the women she helped, I want to thank you. Thank you for being here, for listening with an open heart, for allowing this story to exist within you. Leave a word in the comments that represents what this journey meant to you. The word we use today is gratitude, because that's what we feel when telling this story. Gratitude for Lucía choosing the truth, for overcoming silence, for showing that it is never too late. Like the video, subscribe to the Emotion of Age channel, Activate the bell to receive more real and deep stories like this. And, if you can, share it with someone who needs to believe that the past doesn't define the end of the road. Share with those who need to know that they can still be the protagonist of their own lives. Never forget, dignity is not a prize, it's a right. And even when everything seems lost, it can be recovered with courage, truly, and with self-love. Lucía survived, but more than that, she chose to live, and you can make that choice too. Today, now, it doesn't matter where you are. Thank you very much for walking with us this far. Let this story be more than a script. Let it be a mirror, and that when you look at it, you see yourself neither as a culprit nor as a victim, but as someone who still has time. Time to go back, time to tell the truth, time to start over.